When I graduated from university, I thought I was a good programmer because I was a good student when I was in my programming classes. I aced all my programming classes, and then I was also given the opportunity to be an undergraduate teaching fellow for these programming classes. And so I also taught programming classes. I taught in these discussion sections, and then I had my own office hours. I was teaching students, fellow students who were around the same age as me, some were even older than me, and I was teaching them, helping them with their homework. And I thought I had a pretty good understanding of programming. And so when I went into the workforce, I thought I could tackle any kind of programming assignment. I thought I was really good. But what I learned from working as a software engineer, I soon realized that I wasn't as good as I thought. And what I found quickly was that I also wrote a lot of bad code. And in my eyes, when I was in university, I didn't think I was writing bad code at that time because my definition of what was good and bad was based on if I passed all the test cases that I encountered for my projects. But what I learned when I was working in the workforce is that just making sure that it works doesn't mean that it's good. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining my journey on how I went from being a good student who writes bad code to being a good programmer. And hopefully by sharing this, you will also get some ideas on how you can proactively take some steps to be able to grow in your software development journey so that you will also not be just a good student, but also be a good programmer. So my name's Henrik, and I'm here to help you learn the foundations of software development. And I have a free guide for you that will help you grow in the foundations. It's called my High IQ Software Checklist. And it's just a simple checklist guide that you can use with your own code bases. And then you can go through that checklist to see if you're following some high IQ software principles that will help you go from being a junior coder to be a senior coder. So you can download that in the link in the description. Alright, so the first reason on why good students write bad code, I would say it's because these good students, even though they pass all their assignments, even though they can get straight A's in all of their classes, even though they follow the tutorials perfectly, the reason why they write bad code is because they haven't been exposed to good code. If you've been coding for a while, and especially if you've been coding individually or if you're coding with other people who are at the same level as you, you're going to be able to code things, you're able to get things to work, but you're not really going to know if it's good code or not unless you're exposed to good code, or if you're exposed to better programmers who can show you what is good code. I kind of compare this to the experience of playing basketball. So like I play basketball, and when I go to the neighborhood park and I play basketball there, I can do pretty well, especially on my own. I can make all my shots. And then when I have my friends come over, the neighborhood kids, they all come over, and then we play one-on-one together, and I play with them for many years. I know all of their habits when it comes to playing basketball, and then I can do pretty well. I can win a lot of games, and so in my mind, I can think I'm a good basketball player. But I remember one time I went from my neighborhood to another neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, they're more intense when it comes to playing basketball, and it was my friend's neighborhood, and when I played there, I felt like a really bad basketball player because the people there, they played really well. And the same thing applies to programming. If you've been coding on your own for a while, or if you're just focusing on these tutorials, but if you haven't been exposed to what is good code, if you haven't seen production code, then you're not going to be able to write good code yourself. And I experienced that in my own professional career. When I was in my professional career, I was exposed to a lot of different code bases. So my company would give me a code base, I would take a look at it, and as I would look at it, I would learn a new culture of how to program. And so I would look at it and I would say, oh wow, so this is how the senior programmers code these ideas. And then it gives me sort of like a mental model or a framework that I can build off of. And then it helps me be able to have ideas on how I would build similar projects. So if you look at a code base and then you can learn how that code base works, and then you can start building your own programming projects with the same style or the same kind of culture as that code base. The more code bases you encounter, the more you start to understand this idea of coding philosophy. And coding philosophy is just a fancy way of talking about how different programmers think about implementing certain ideas in their heads. So when we're programmers, all we're doing is just putting things in our head and then making the computer do what we're thinking. but different programmers have different philosophies on how they would like the computer to do it. And so when you study these different code bases, when you're exposed to different code bases, in my company, I was exposed to different professional code bases, some that were written that were like third-party code bases. Some code bases were code bases from other senior engineers who were at my company. And so when you get exposed to how different programmers write code, then you can have you start to understand that there's a different kind of culture. Same happens with like sports. There's different kinds of emphases when it comes to playing in a certain way. Different, like for example, like I mentioned earlier about basketball, you would have a different basketball philosophy depending on which neighborhood you go to. And so when you're trying to learn how to become better at programming, it's always good to look at different code bases, try to study them, and see what these programmers were thinking on what was their philosophy on how they coded those projects. All right, the second reason why good students are bad coders is because they may not have enough mentors, or they may not have mentors in their life who could help them grow. I remember my first year when I was coding at my first company, I was pretty much coding on my own. I was given this C project or the C++ project, and then I had to implement so I was working in a research company, and my supervisor was a PhD, and then he had these ideas that he wanted to implement, and he wanted to see if I could apply those principles in this C project or the C++ project. So I implemented his ideas in that C++ project, and so I was coding on my own. But it was only until I started working on a different project that I really got better at programming. And that's because in that other project, it was more of a product development project. And when you think about product development, you want to make sure your code is something that can handle different kinds of test cases, different kinds of edge cases. When I was working for that PhD research project, I wasn't really thinking about edge cases. I was really thinking just about applying some principles and then seeing if it works as intended. But when I was working on the product development project, when we were actually building a product that we could potentially sell at our company, the mindset was different. And in that product development that project, that's where I really grew as a software developer. And that's because that was my first exposure to what is called peer code reviews. So when I was working on that product development project, we were doing a lot of code reviews. That was my first exposure to code reviews. And so they would give me these tasks, and then these tasks I would either be given a feature task or a bug task. So either I'm adding a new feature to our product or I'm fixing a bug. So I would have these tasks, and then when I would code it, in my student philosophy, I would think I was doing a good job because I made sure that my code worked. And even a lot of times I would try to make sure I was passing all of my test cases. So I'm passing all of my test cases. I'm making sure it's working. I didn't break anything. And then when I submit it for code review, the other senior engineers, they would look at my code, and then they would always have something to say. They always have some sort of criticism or some way that I could have coded something better. And that's how I really grew at programming, when I had these older senior programmers look at my actual code. That product development project also got me exposed to different programming languages. So I got more exposure on how the coding philosophies are different with different programming languages. So I got exposed to Python, C++, and Java. And I think those were the main programming languages that I got exposed to. But whenever they would give me a task, I would do something, and then the senior engineers, they would always have something to say about the code I was submitting. And there were also often many times where I was told to code in Python. I didn't have Python experience at that time, and I was coding in Python. And a lot of times I would get stuck, and I would think about, how do I fix this bug, or how do I address this issue? And so that's when I would talk to the more senior programmers on how I would go about it, or they would give me some hints on how to go about it. And that's how you can really grow and write better code. That's how you can go from being a good student who writes bad code to being a good student who writes good code. Or rather, just a good programmer in general, is if you have people who can push you to do things that you're uncomfortable with. And so having those kinds of people around me in that professional working environment, that's what really helped me become a better programmer. All right, the third and final reason that I'll mention for why good students write bad code is because, and I kind of alluded to this since the beginning of the video, I think it's because good students are more focused on getting things to work. And so it's a different philosophy. They're not thinking about the future. When you're a student working in university, you just want to make sure you pass all the requirements. But when you're a programmer who writes good code, when you're a good programmer, you're also anticipating the future. You're also thinking forward. And that will include making your code more readable for the future. Because when you're coding in a code base, you also have to think about what about in the future if there are other programmers who are going to build off of what I'm doing, then I want to make sure it's readable. I want to add comments in there. I want to make it easy for them to make some adjustments. And so you're thinking about future programmers. When you're coding in the university, you're not really thinking about future programmers because once you turn in your assignment, then that's it. You're done with the code. No one's ever going to build off of it. But when you're working in a production environment, when you're working in a professional environment, you also have to have this understanding that you're not going to be the last person who's going to work on that code. So you're going to be thinking about the future, and you want to make sure that the future developers or your teammates, they can understand what you're doing. You don't want to write obscure code and make it really hard for people to understand and admit. And also, like, you're going to be you may be coding on that project, or you may be coding with that code base in the future as well. And so you also have to think about yourself. And oftentimes when you're coding in a company, you're eventually going to forget what you were doing before. And so you have to make sure that you make it easy for your future self to know what you're doing. So that will involve like making sure you name your variables really well. You don't want to just name your variables like X, Y, or A or B, or make some weird naming convention. You want to make sure you're choosing variable names that are intuitive, things that make sense, and that are readily understandable. And a lot of times, even in my company right now, there's a lot of times where the previous developers were really bad at this. They would use one word for this and then one word for that. And so even in those cases, I also try to make some adjustments so that we would be more consistent across the code base. And that would make it easier for future programmers. So this idea of not just getting the code to work, but also making it readable, making it more modular. That's something that I always talk about. You want to make your code modular in the sense that you don't want code, you want to make sure that there's modules in your programming, in your code base, so that there's inputs and then there's outputs. You want one module here, one module there, and then have a clear input output for each module so that it becomes more modular. And if you make your code more modular, then when something breaks, you already know how to narrow down which module is the issue, and then you can fix the module that is broken in that case. Also, another part of being a good programmer is also adding in some good test code. So something that I learned from another senior programmer is that he would put in some global variables that are meant for debugging, and he wouldn't enable them. I mean, it's not part of the production build, but it's there for engineers. So like when we're doing some testing and then something happens with the hardware or something happens with our product, then he can look at those debug variables, and he already has like different logs that he can go to. He has different variables, some counters when there are some error conditions that happened. That's something that I always appreciated about him. He would enable the debug variables, he would run the program, and then when the issue happens, he can just check on those debug variables. Something you learn about your code base is that there's a common way of debugging your code. And so you don't want to create the same debugging infrastructure every time you're debugging the same issue. You want to put that debugging infrastructure in there already, so that when the issues happen, you can just enable that debugging infrastructure and then figure out what's going on. When you're a good student, you're not really thinking about debugging infrastructure. Even in my case, I would have a lot of debug code when I was working on my projects. and then when I'm talking about coding projects in university. And then when my code works, I would just remove all of the debug code from there so it's nice and clean. And it is nice and clean, it's easy to look at, and then the professor can grade it well. But when you're a good software developer, you want to leave that debug code in there so that you can enable it in case something bad were to happen with your code. All right, so those are the 3 reasons that came to my mind when it comes to thinking about why good students write bad code. The first one, again, is they haven't been exposed to good code. So for you, that means you should also look into different code bases. Try to learn from other code bases that other programmers have built on, and code bases that people say are good code bases. So study those so that you have more intuition on what is good code. And then second one is surrounding yourself with other good coders. You don't want to be like me when it came to basketball, where I'm playing basketball with the same kids and then I think I'm good at basketball. You want to be in those neighborhoods where you're the one who's the worst basketball player or you're the worst coder, and then you can learn from the other better coders there and then pick up their skills, pick up their intuition, and then be a good programmer overall. And the key idea here is mentorship. You want other people to mentor you, and that's how you can easily and quickly get to becoming a good programmer. And then the last mindset shift is shifting from just making your code work to making it more readable and more future-proof. Okay, I'd love to hear your reasons too. What are some reasons that good students write bad code? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Alright, that's it for this week's video. I hope it helped you out and gave you some ideas on how you can grow from being just a good student or just being a good learner to being a good programmer. And if you want more tips on how to become a better programmer, you can download my high IQ software checklist. It will help you go from being a low IQ programmer to being a high IQ programmer. You can download that in the link in the description. And if you want to see another video on how to go from being a junior programmer to a professional programmer, you can check out this video over here, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.